Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Here at the Almond Joy Factory, where tropical vibes abound, we use soft, fresh-tasting coconut.
The crunchiest almonds and delicious chocolate candy.
Ah, but do you know what our most important ingredient is?
Sometimes you feel like a nut.
Sometimes you don't.
Almond Joy's got nuts and something even way better than that. Yes, Almond Joy is made with almonds and joy.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra is giving you the chance to win tickets to the NBA Finals. That's right, the 2025 NBA Finals. Just head to MichelobUltra.com/NBA Finals. Michelob Ultra Courtside NBA Finals Sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents, excluding Maryland residents. 21 up. Begins at 9 a.m. EST on February 16, 2025. Ends on May 5th, 2025. See official rules at MichelobUltra.com/rules for price and details. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into
the wrong station. Chapter 1. The Raid. A power sword can do terrible things to the human body. She turned the weapon in her hand, a cool handspan of 32-inch ceramic with a rounded point and heavy cylinder pommel. In less than 2 minutes, it would tear through another human being. Maybe a weapon like it would tear through her. She shifted in the fallen needles. Her ceramic armor muttered, its soft clack of scales lost in the sound of wind in cold pines. 8 men were seated at a fire in the clearing ahead, sheltered from rain or snow by the downturned nose of their shuttle. They wore heavy armor and good Empire weapons. Slavers, chartered by some reputable traffic house on Oyam or Viminac. This was hostile territory, but they were calm, passing around a bottle of liquor. This was a bad sign. It meant they'd only just landed. They didn't know their hornet's nest was kicked already. It meant they weren't the slavers Bleda and her volunteers were hunting. "I want to come with you," her son had told her. She glanced down the line. Her comrades spread into the darkness of the woods, the nearest barely seen by the haze of the slavers' fire. She didn't whisper her suspicions to the comm. They were too close to enemy ears. And the others were all like her anyway. They weren't here to rescue Thyra. Not really. They were all licking blackened teeth in the dark, with their hands working at the hilts of swords and pistols. They were here for themselves. "Why is it so important to you?" she'd asked her boy. Larrick was friends with Thyra's brother. She'd expected him to say so. But it was all identity for him. "I'm a Volth," he'd told her simply. He'd been carrying his father's sword. Now a voice murmured in Bleda's earpiece. "Roysha. I'm on the far side. Ship's unlocked. Action in less than 10. Bleda drew a slow breath, counted to 5, then levered herself into something like a sprinter's crouch. She felt, more than saw, the other Volths do the same, one after the other so no one at the fire would sense large movements in the dark. She kept her eyes on the plasteel bubble of the ship's turret. The slavers weren't stupid. They had one man stationed at the full caliber inside. As she watched, this half-seen slaver called over his shoulder to someone inside the ship, shaking his empty beer can. Blada was already moving when Roysha stepped from the darkness and put a bolt of gold light through his chest. The flash and scream of the pistol. The slavers of the fire were on their feet, but the edge of Blada's shield was already crunching an orbital bone, grinding dirt from the forest floor into a slaver's pulped eye. She flicked on her power sword, and its rim of gold fire sprang alive just as she thrust it into the slaver's breastplate. Organs exploded. Then she raised the body and sheltered behind it as bullets turned to spall against her overshield. The dead man was shredded to rags as she drove forward. Her overshield crackled out, but she was already shearing down through a sword arm, driving her shield into someone else's jaw.
"Scatter!"
Someone shouted, and Blada threw herself to one side as the full caliber roared behind her. Suddenly the air was full of choking dust, and she was scrambling to her feet on the other side of the shuttle's nose. Without even thinking, she crashed up the ramp and down metal corridors that rocked from the recoil of the heavy gun. It smelled of septic sprayed with bleach inside. Roysha was lying crumpled in the hall. Her killer was framed inside the turret by the muzzle flash. He never saw Blada coming. She stepped over her friend and with no hesitation drove the power sword out to the front of his face. Cooked brains steamed on the inside of the glass. Cooked blood oozed black from the coin slot of the slaver's face. Then everything was quiet. Guma crackled in her earpiece. "All clear outside, Blada. You all right?" "All clear inside. I'm fine. Royce dead." Gedrat. Gedrat. It meant something like stalwart. The ship itself was called the Dal Urge, which meant something like slave maker. There were no slaves aboard this time, but no matter how much bleach you used, that stale septic smell of caged people never got out of the metal on a ship like that. The volunteers had failed, of course. Thyra was gone, somewhere in the steely darkness of a ship like this one, somewhere across the Than Nebula's multicolored skies. But none of them felt like they'd failed. They all grinned and laughed and clapped each other on the back and called themselves Gedrats. They felt like great vaults of the legendary past. Sold and split between the 6 survivors, the slaving ship would make them rich. That was how it all began, with glorious violence. Chapter 2. The Bonfire. There were 6 survivors of the raid. They were Blada, Guma, Guskar, Ruga, Timra, and Stitha. Guskar had been knocked unconscious in the fighting, and they weren't sure if he'd live. They stripped the slavers' bodies and left them to rot, then hosed the blood and cooked brains out of the shuttle and flew it down to a green by the water. Ruga and Guma were the strongest, so they loaded Guskar onto a stretcher and carried him the furlong down to the doctor's house. Guma was tall, broad-shouldered, and handsome. Ruga was slouched and sullen as an ape. With them gone, the 2 women began to build the fire. Stitha was a half-decade older than Blada, all tendon and cartilage. She lived on a trapline above town, so she sparked the kindling while Blada gathered fuel. Timra went home to get himself cleaned up. He was quiet and diligent, but had opened a slaver at the lower gut, and his armor was all caked in sewage. By the time he returned, with bleach bottles full of clear liquor from his still, Guma and Ruga were back as well. The fire was high, and Roysha laid out on a table wrapped in white cloth. And the community was filing in by 1s and 2s. Someone hooked up their Ansible to the shuttle speakers. Then it was a party. When many of the bleach bottles were empty, Guma jumped up onto a rock to make a speech. "A few weeks ago, when I came home," he shouted, "I thought I was in for a quiet retirement." Most of the party laughed. He'd wiped the black off his fine teeth so they shone with the firelight. Empire service had made him sleek and strong, where it turned a lot of men wretched. You know, some people have asked why I came home when I did. This is why. Right here, tonight. 7 of us against 10 of them and a heavy gun, and we wiped them out. Only Volths could do that. Only Gedrots. I came home because this is where I want to be. With my people. Their struggles. Listen to this shit, Ruga muttered. Bleda said, I'm hearing it. Her eyes were on her son, who was on the other side of the fire, with his face aglow as Guma spoke. Not exactly like it was a fair fight, Ruga went on. He was in his cups. We cut a couple throats and now we're what? Patriots? If we'd saved the girl, said Stitha, on Bleda's other side, that might have been worth a speech. She gave an ugly smile. Her teeth were still black. But we all knew that she was long, long gone. Guma, meanwhile, was still preaching. Deroysha! He shouted, raising bleach container high. Gedrot! Gedrot! Shouted the crowd. Spare us, Ruga muttered. Gedrot! Lerick shouted. Chapter 3. Nostoi. Things aren't simple. Not only the Empire took slaves, and not only the Empire bought slaves. You could find farm slaves, house slaves, sex slaves across Skanza and the Volthic worlds. Many bought in those same traffic houses on Oyam or Viminac. Most of the coin on Volthic worlds was Empire coin. When the raiders eventually found a buyer for the Dollarge down in Starfall, each 6th would be paid out in heavy red gold Empire hyperpyrons. And Bleda would recognize the face imprinted on each coin. Volts like Guma, and like Lerick's father, brought them home. And who looks down on him who comes home rich? If there was any contradiction between killing Empire slavers and killing for the Empire, few Volts were awake to it. Not long after Guma's speech at the bonfire, another Gedrot came home. Such veterans came home in batches, because every few years the Empire decided it needed more citizen soldiers and fewer barbarian mercenaries. But they tended to leave in batches too, because every few years another civil war broke out, and suddenly the fleets weren't as picky. It was one of those gray Skanza mornings when boys walked down the damp roadsides, swinging brown-rotted sticks, the dead heads of chicory. But unlike most mornings, there were people out. A small group gathered round the crossroads where Timra lived, in a home built from a rusted shipping container. The November sun was coming through, and the last elm leaves falling gold and snaggle-toothed. A Huv was pulled up on the edge of an empty lot across from Timra's. The man who leaned against it, talking mildly with a few neighbors, was gray-haired, at about 2 meters height. Carrieto! The Gedrot glanced up, his big face splitting in a gold-toothed smile. Well, that isn't young Lerick. The boy ran forward, and Timra stood aside smiling as Lerick took the big man's hand and tried to crush it with his handshake. Carrieto laughed and squeezed back. His hand was the size and shape of a generator motor, and Lerick yelped and sank to one knee. Not yet, kid, he rumbled, loosening his grip. Lerick jumped up, laughing. Won't be long now, though. You're your old man come again, you know that? The compliment meant so much that Lerick couldn't speak for a moment. You ever meet the kid's dad, Timra? One of the only guys who ever made me feel small. Timra smiled, because it wasn't quite true, but it was generous. Wish he was still with us, Carrieto. Hey, Bleda! The big man raised his hand, and the adults half turned as Lerick's mother stumped down through the brown grass of the empty lot. She had a broad smile on her scarred face, and she clapped the big man in an embrace. More beautiful than ever, eh? She whacked him in the gut and pulled away. I could say the same to you. Someone break your nose again? It happens, don't it? She couldn't disagree. Her own nose was nearly flat. "You back for good, then?" Timur asked. Well, that depends." The big man rubbed the back of his head. "Still waiting on payment for a bit of work, but if things come through like they're supposed to, yeah, I'll be retired." "Finally," Bleda said. Carrieto laughed. "Finally yourself. I hear you two have been working." To Gadrat, work meant violence. And prize money, too. Bleda raised her hands. "Not worth talking about. 1/6 of a ship, by sword. Single moms don't get up to that sort of thing in the Empire." She smiled in spite of herself. She was a Volth. She wasn't immune to pride. "Carrieto!" Lyric had been waiting anxiously on the conversation's edge. "What is it, little man?" "Do you know Guma? He just got back from the Empire, like you. He led the raid. He's a real Gadrat." "And a patriot," said Ruga. He'd appeared at the sidelines. The big man raised his chin and laughed, pretending he hadn't heard Ruga's shot. "A real Gadrat, eh? Well, I'll have to talk shop sometime." "Now that you're back, will you spar with me?" the kid asked. But the big man raised his hands. "All that's behind me these days, son. I think you should talk to your man Guma." Chapter 4. The Stranger. Under Skanza's pines, Lyric and his friends grew up making coracles of wicker and old tarpaulin. They'd paddle out across black water on the endless bogs, and from time to time find great shards of steel, ceramic, concrete jutting out at angles from the slime. Rusted, crumbling, cracked, and yellowed, these relics of the Empire set fire to their imaginations. Sometimes Lyric went alone, to climb old ruins and gaze at yellow horizons of reedgrass, gilt glass, and winter willow. He didn't understand the feeling it gave him to gaze at that vastness of black water and golden life, which had come up over ruined cities and installations. But it was a feeling profound and powerful and true. Not long after the raid, he sat on the facade of a drowned tenement, thinking about his friend's sister Thyra, whom the slavers had taken. She'd been a broad, plain girl who knew everything to know about marsh birds. She wasn't how he assumed people were supposed to be, women especially, and that had often made him uncomfortable. But now he felt her absence keenly. There was work in the world she was supposed to do, and from which she'd been stolen. As if in response to this thought, a low gold light appeared in the reeds. Lyric stood, and a gondola glided from the cattails, guided by the hands of a tall and gray-haired man. He was not a Volth. Some Volths had very dark skin like his, but few, and he was dressed like an Empire technician in dark blue coveralls of sturdy drill. Despite his lack of coat, he seemed unbothered by the cold, and above his gray stubble, this stranger had one milky eye, the result of a ragged scar which carved his face in thirds. 3 drones were flying with him, and they paused now and then on the water surface to snap a sharp gold light into its depths. "Stop!" Lyric tried to deepen his voice, resting a hand on the knife at his hip. "Who are you?" The stranger looked up in surprise, then smiled, raising both hands in surrender. His teeth were clean. "Easy, comrade. Just a traveler passing through." "Are you armed?" "No." The stranger looked down at himself, as if for a holster or sheath. "I'm no threat to anyone." This was plainly untrue. Strong men struggled to drive and unstick a punt pole from the mire beneath these waters. The stranger cruised without effort, and Lyric recognized the smoothness of his movements. He moved like Bleda, Carrieto, Guma, like a Gadrat. And that scar, he'd seen its like, had been delivered by a power sword. You don't belong here, Laric told him. This world is the vaults. The man lowered his hands slowly, anchoring his craft. Well then, I see I've fallen in with a patriot. Laric folded his arms. So what? The stranger was still smiling. His scar made the expression strange. No judgment. I was once a patriot too. But I was a little older than you are now. I decided I'd dedicate my life to the liberation of the Ozum. Laric didn't know who the Ozum were. So you're a soldier? Was. Once. You want to know what happened next? No. Still that off-putting smile. The stranger spread one hand, keeping his other on the pole. Disaster struck. We won. Laric said nothing. He felt he was being made fun of. It was the worst thing that could have happened to us. You know, we rebelled because of the strip mining and the executions. But rebellions need money, money, money. And money means debt. And debt meant the strip mining started right back up as soon as we won. And since we resisted the strip mining, well, the executions started back up too. So now, the Ozum were masters of our own fate, but we used that mastery to oppress the Ozum. And so people like me, well, we went from being patriots to the kind of people patriots try to kill. In spite of himself, Laric found his interest caught. He shot out his chin. Where are you from? Far away. The Empire? Farther still. You ever hear of a place called Red Sublime? No. Well, then keep your eyes open. If you're lucky, you might see it someday. Suddenly, one of his drones chimed. Hey now, got a bite. Well, bring it up now. Bring it up. The drone whirred like a satisfied animal and dropped a gold field into the water. Under that light, the surface began to boil cold, as if under a bell jar. What is it? The boy asked. Well, I'm as curious as you. After a few moments, a clump from the swamp appeared at the boiling surface, and when the little drone had clasped it with brass claws, the field snapped out. The drone chirped and zoomed over to the stranger, who crouched on the floor of his punt to examine the prize. Well, here's a real find. He dipped it into the water to shake off some slime, then applied a stiff brush to reveal pitted gold, then rinsed it again, buffing it clean with soft chamois from one of his many pockets. The object revealed was an irregular shape, with an irregular hole worn through, about the size in total of a small bird. You know what this is? The stranger asked, looking through the hole. Laric shook his head. Hagstone. The stranger chirped to one of his drones, which zipped over and scanned the object with a gold beam, chirruping a stream of information back. Oh, and it looks like it has one charge left. One charge of what? Still squatting, the man squinted up at Laric and held his gaze for an uncomfortable moment. Then he glanced down at the hagstone, then back up. What's your name, Volth? He said at last. Laric should have known better than to give a stranger his name. But he told him. Do Volths believe in things like fate, Laric? Laric shrugged. Sure. Well, we don't really believe in fate on Red Sublime, the stranger said. But we like to stay humble. It gives me a strange feeling to find something like this right after meeting you. Suddenly, he threw the hagstone across the 30 feet of water between them. Laric caught it instinctively. It was cold and a little slimy, but heavy and beautiful. It was wrought. Not a lot of things were wrought on Skanza. Why are you giving me this? It's not what I was looking for, the stranger said. And this is the vaults world, right? I can't just go around digging things up without permission. So, if anyone asks, I'll say I paid my dues to Lerick, and they can take it up with him. He stood, wiped his hands, and set them to the pole. Is this real gold? Lerick asked. We don't really believe in gold on Red Sublime, the stranger said. He was already sliding past. Where do you think you're going? Lerick demanded. Hey, come back! But the reeds parted, and the stranger's craft slid through them, leaving barely a ripple in its wake. Chapter 5. Gedrots. Later, at an open fire on the hearth beside the Dal Urge, Lerick found some of the men drinking Timrah still liquor from the old bleach bottles. Lerick, Guma shouted as he approached. Come take your place among the vaults. He sat with them timidly, between Guma and Timrah. You look like you've got something on your mind, little man, said Carrieto. Lerick stared at the fire for a moment. The golden thing was heavy in his pocket, out of sight. What kind of person doesn't believe in gold? He asked. They met his question thoughtfully. Riddles were part of Volthic culture. Someone who's rich already, Timrah guessed. But Guma tossed his head. Well, shouldn't think too much about gold. Here we go, said Ruga. I've known a lot of Vols who did, Guma, said Carrieto. Our thoughts, Guma insisted, should be about nation and honor, in that order. Gold is for Empire bankers. Ruga was in his cups again. He couldn't contain himself. Come on, Guma, you're a mercenary. You'd still be with the Empire if they weren't getting rid of savages, so stop acting like you're something nobler than a hired knife. Guma was instantly on his feet, his blade in hand. Ruga was up a heartbeat later. I've heard every last piece of your muttering, Ruga. Guma's eyes were blue and hard, and I'm sick of it. And I'm fed up with fellas, said Carrieto, standing between them with his big hands out. Let's not do this, eh? Let's show this kid a better way to be. The two men glanced down at Lerick. Neither of them looked at each other for a moment. Then Ruga sniffed and shrugged, and sat. I'll play nice. Guma was still standing. Insult me if you like, and I'll answer it, he told Ruga. But the Vols aren't savages, and I won't stand by and let you talk about your own people like... Ruga glanced at Carrieto. Should I stand up again? All right, Guma, come on. Sit down, would you? Said Carrieto. Let's focus on Lerick and his questions. Yeah? Guma took control of himself with visible effort and sat down. Now, Lerick, said Carrieto. Person who doesn't need gold, you said? Lerick nodded. He was feeling shy after the raised voices. The king of the vaults, I guess, said Guma. He was bitter. Even he's broke, Timrah quipped. The others laughed. Even Guma a little bit. But Carrieto was frowning. This person, are they from around here? He asked Lerick. No. The big man looked around the fire. And I can only think of one kind of person who doesn't have to worry too much about money. They all looked at him. A slaver. After dropping Lerick at home, the men went out that night on hubs over the marshes, shining spotlights down into the black water. But they caught no sign of the stranger, nor of whatever ship or shuttle he'd arrived on. When they met back at the Dal Urge, they resolved to try again the next day. By then, it was well past midnight. And by the time they rose again, late next morning, one of them was dead. Chapter 6. The Body. He was lying in the road, with his face turned toward Starfall, and his bloody fingertips clawed in the gravel. His body ended at about the midway point of his pelvis. Someone had slowly pressed the edge of a power sword into his trunk as he tried to crawl away, burning through bones and tender innards all the way down to the pubic crest. Then that person had stepped on the dying Ruga's back, pressing the intestines a few inches out. Raw sausage cut in half and pressed out of the casing. A thoughtful display. Performative. A few inches back toward town lay a 6-inch segment of Ruga's genitals and buttocks and upper thighs. A few yards further, another pair of pale, matched cylinders, slightly shorter in length than they were in depth. Then, a few yards further, you could find Ruga's knees staggered a couple inches apart. Something neat about it all, like paper cut with scissors. All in all, the Gadrat was lying in about 10 sets of pieces, with his lower body stretched out over nearly 30 feet of road. His boots, with the feet still inside, were tucked neatly off to the side. A small crowd had gathered, but no one wanted to do anything but stand witness. It was as if touching the body would have been to get involved. So before long, it was only the surviving raiders gathered at the front. "I've seen a lot of things in war," said Carrieto, "but never anything like this." "Whoever did it must have hated him," Stetha murmured. She didn't look back at Guma. "Or they were trying to send a message," suggested Bleda. "What kind of message?" "He always had a poisoned tongue," said Guskar. The older man was back on his feet, with his ribs wrapped and one arm slung. "I guess he finally used it on the wrong person." Guma's face was flushed. He knew everyone was thinking about his argument with Ruga, but he managed to keep his voice calm. "If that's what happened, there'd be signs of a fight. He'd have a clean wound in his guts, or his head cut off. Not this butchery." "We can't rule out this is linked to the raid," said Bleda, but Stetha was lurking behind her. "You just don't want to think this was one of us," she murmured. Bleda ignored her. No Volth would do this to one of their own. Guma seized on that idea. "There was that man Larrick met in the swamps. Carrieto thought he might have been a slaver." "Aren't we overthinking things?" Timra asked. "There's no shortage of desperate men with swords on Skanza." "Well, he didn't take his weapon or his purse," Carrieto rumbled. "So what are we saying?" said Guskar. "That the rest of us are in danger?" "Let's not jump to conclusions," said Timra. Larrick was standing on the edge of the crowd, staring blankly down at the body. Guma called out to him. "Larrick! Larrick! This foreigner you saw. You said he told you he was a soldier?" "Step aside with me for a minute," Stetha whispered in Bleda's ear and pulled her off. Timra noticed them go. Yes, he said he'd been a soldier once," Larrick responded. "Where? Empire?" "No." Larrick tried to remember. "He said something like Red Salan." "Was it Red Sublime?" There was an edge in Carrieto's voice. "Is that what he said?" I think that was it." "And how was he dressed? Simply, like a worker dressed in blue?" Larrick nodded. A silence had fallen on the crowd. "An anagogue," Carrieto said, quietly. "What's an anagogue?" "Religious zealots," Guma told him. "Fanatics, political terrorists." "What would an anagogue mystic have to do with slavers?" Timra said. "Same thing as anyone else," said Carrieto. "Money. I've heard they do assassinations," Guskar agreed. Something the stranger had said popped into Larrick's mind. "Rebellions cost money. He said something like that." "When I fought on Merodek," said Carrieto, "the radicals had anagogues on their side." The picture was coming together. Guskar asked, And would an Anagog be capable of something like this? Carietto nodded. It shook Larrick to see the big man look so grim, so close to fear. Now Guma spoke up. The redness of his face had faded to blotchy white. "Look, Ruga and I didn't get along," he declared. "But I respected him as a Gadrat and as a Voth. Whoever did this had no respect. I suggest we find them and teach them some." There was a moment's silence. "What do you say?" asked Guma, raising his voice. But there was no outcry of support. It was a cold morning. Thin snow had begun falling from the wintry sky. "I'll go with you," said Carietto at length. "So much for my retirement." "Good man." Guma clapped him on the arm. "What about the rest of you?" "I don't see we have much choice," said Timra. A murmur of support came from the crowd at last. Off to one side, Stetha and Bleda were still speaking in hushed tones. Timra watched them from the corner of his eye. "There's something we're not considering," the wiry woman muttered. "What's that?" said Bleda. 1/6 of a ship. That's an awful lot of gold. Bleda glanced up sharply at Guma, Guskar, Timra, standing at the body. Timra looked away. "You think it was one of us?" she said. "And if it was," said Stetha, "then the rest of us are still in danger." Chapter 7. Trapline. Cold, clear moonlight filtered down through thin pines and bare birches. The snow had thickened all afternoon, and the world was white enough that Stetha didn't have to use her torch. The white scales of her armor blended in with the snow. She moved easily, despite the weight of scales and shield and power sword and Zed gun at her thigh. She was a Gadrat, and she wasn't afraid of the creatures they called wolves and bears, or of the lizardly catamounts which sometimes tried to drive her off from her own snares. But she was afraid. That was why she retreated up country to her trapline, to the wilderness known only to her place of power. At the cleft between two hills, the ground was soggy underneath its crust of ice. A white rabbit hung snapped from one of her snares. She crouched smoothly beside it, humming to herself as she cut the body from its wire noose. There wasn't any sound under the hush of falling snow, nothing to give anything away. But suddenly she knew she was being hunted. She didn't know how she knew, but she'd spent enough time in the woods to know what it felt like. She sniffed and tucked the stiff, furry body into a satchel at the small of her back. Then she stood and trudged up country as if nothing was the matter. A catamount, she decided. A bear would have come out to contest her kill. A pack of wolves would stalk her, but there was a diffuse malice that a hunting pack gave off. This felt focused, personal. The catamount would attack from above and behind when she was walking downhill through rocks. It would try and break her neck or bite through her spine. She considered flicking on her overshield, but in the cold the battery would drain fast. So instead she cinched her heavy backpack tight, hoping its bulk would keep the animal from getting the clean, quick hit it needed to kill her before she could kill it back. She trudged on. Her stone bothy was only an hour away. As she veered through rising pines, a twig snapped softly in the distance behind her. She didn't look back, but the noise made her stomach drop. Catamounts never made a sound. When the hill crest brought her briefly past the tree line, she finally allowed herself to look back. Slopes veered away under black skies, and the night was staticked by blowing flakes. Far below, she could see the lights of town and the route she'd taken up. A sudden thought occurred. She fumbled off one fish-scale gauntlet and then rooted in her pocket for a tarnished old scouter. The thing was broken, but still fit over one eye as long as she held it in place. Beyond its lens, the world turned pink. She tapped out a few commands on the scouter console by her temple, and a section of the world circumscribed itself and magnified. There, her own footprints in the distance, not yet filled with snow. And beside them, ice seeped into her blood. A second set. She changed views and scanned the forest below for heat. Nothing. But she knew damn well something was out there and following her. Someone. She put the scouter away and made sure to shrug. She could feel them watching. She bounded down the far slope, double time. This was her trap line, and she knew the woods well. She knew her footprints would be easy to follow in the snow, so at the bottom of the ravine she turned up the stream and followed its course for a few 100 meters, stepping from rock to rock, or else walking along stretches of gravel. The flowing water turned her feet to ice. Then she followed a tributary up and climbed out in the snow shadow of a fallen tree. Under the gloom of a stand of hemlocks above, she crouched and waited in silence for half an hour. She knew how to be patient. No one appeared. That sense, the hunter's sense, told her she'd lost her shadow. But she waited another 20 minutes to be sure. Then, silent, she stood and crunched cross-country through deepening snow. It's easy to get lost in snowy woods at night, even if they're woods you know. But Stetha knew she'd cross her own trap line eventually. In another half hour, she recognized one of her own surreptitious rock markers. A half hour after that, she was crouched in the woods above the stone bothy where she'd never brought another human being. It was 2 or 3 in the morning now, and well below freezing. She was bitterly cold. But she was tough and smart, and so she waited. With her scouter losing power slowly, she sat on her haunches for the better part of another hour. Nothing moved. The pink lens registered no heat. She felt uneasy, but the woods could feel uneasy at the best of times. So she made her slow way down to the stone shack. No light glimmered within, and when she put a hand to the door, it was locked. She was tempted to relax, but she was cautious and listened at the door. Nothing moved inside for a long time. She drew power sword and unslung shield and flicked her overshield on. It hummed in the falling snow. Then she burst through the door. Nothing. No burst of gunfire, no dark figure in the dark within. A faint taste of old smoke on the freezing air. The edge of her weapon sizzled as a dust mote drifted across it. In that momentary flare, she saw something dark on the low bed against the far wall. For a moment, she thought it was just some old clothes on the mattress. But she always left the bothy neat, so she raised the burning blade and took a half-step forward through the smell of smoke. A dim gold glow crept across her old plank floors and up the legs of the bed. Then her breath caught. Not close. The body had been carved clean and thin, as if by a mandolin. There was no blood to stain her bedding, only greasy ash from the chiffonade of flesh. For a moment, her jaw hung slack. She couldn't imagine the delicacy and control it took to so disassemble a body. A power sword is not a subtle tool. So she stood, frozen, until something put itself together in her head. The vertical slices of face stacked at an angle on her bedding. She recognized them, despite the black burned streaks, the reddened skin, the burst and hollow eyes. That was when her wits snapped back into place, and she knew the depth of danger she was in. Without another moment's hesitation, she turned back out into the snow. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, that hunter's instinct spoke to her again. She was noticed. She was seen. Her predator was here. Everything slowed down. The snow blew thickly through the trees. All the world was white. She could feel her heart pounding against her armor. Then, a white silhouette stepped forth. Ceramic scales and shield, all opal white with snow and freezing rain. A white ceramic helm, studded as with thorns, and masked with flat, pearlescent glass. The figure seemed out of all proportion with the world as it descended through the snow toward her, silent, perfect silent in the burning cold. It loomed larger than the pines and wider than the hills above her. She felt herself shrink. She felt something fail within. Cold fingers fumbled at her power sword's hilt. Her shield weighed suddenly 100 pounds. Now the snow fell thick as the end of the world. The winter came for her, and its armored hand thumbed the catch of a weapon's hilt, and a power sword's edge burned falling snow the color of sunset. She understood the meaning of that red-gold edge. She knew just what it could do to the human body. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, Power Sword Part 1, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Brian Chang, Rosalind Harnias, TMS KS22, Nakajima 96, Birdfoot, Tracy, Jay, Weir Puppafoon, Mal Horseleech, and Gwyneth Barton for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station, and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until Part 2, thank you for listening.